Showbiz.
Bob, are you ready?
I got my cheering plaque over here.
And then when you're ready,
My Lord.
Well, I guess it's going to be harder.
you have to have it.
One day you'll be sent to prison.
I told them not to come. I don't like people.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
But they decided anyway.
I want to welcome you all here on behalf of Penn and the New York Review. I should say that although former Police Commissioner Raymond Kelly had been announced, he was suddenly called away to consult with the Attorney General in Washington, and so we're extremely fortunate to have with us another former Police Commissioner, Richard J. Condon, and our particular thanks to him for joining us. Now, the impulse to have this meeting arose as a discussion among some writers and editors at the Penn Club. Their thought was simple enough. The question of crime is more than ever on all our minds these days. We have among us some immensely skillful, gifted writers who in one form or another deal with crime. They have their own perceptions of its sources, the motives of the criminals, the way they're dealt with by the police, the prosecutors, the prison, the entire criminal justice system they write about in one way or another. Yet these imaginative writers are hardly ever asked how they themselves view the actual problems of crime and punishment that surround us. What might they say about them? And at the same time, we have within that criminal justice system some very distinguished police officials and judges and prosecutors who we know have their own hard-won understanding of the causes and workings of crime and are willing to express their views about it. How do their perceptions compare with those of the writers? And how do they view the way crime and themselves are presented in the novels, in the press, in television? They are, it must be said, hardly ever asked such questions. Indeed, so far as we know, the writers about crime and the officials who have to deal with it have never been brought together before as they have this evening. And to preside over them, as in effect the judge of judges, we're lucky, I think, to have Murray Kempton of Newsday, about whom there is a consensus that he's not only the most distinguished journalist in the city, but also the most acute observer of the life of the courts and the precinct houses, as one can see from his recent collection of articles entitled Rebellions, Perversities, and Main Events. Now, of the several justice officials who have kindly agreed to join us, we have in the center former Police Commissioner Condon, Police Commissioner from 1989 and 1990. He rose to that position through a series of major jobs in the city and state police force. He was early on in the 70s commanding officer of the downtown precincts. He became the head of the special squad of the Queens District Attorney, and then he was director of investigation in the office of the special prosecutor, and then he was first deputy commissioner in charge of running the entire police department. He's written on the problem of police corruption. He's the author of a special report to the governor on the police use of deadly force. Now, at the far closer to me, we have Judge Edwin Torres, who's described how he made his way from the barrio of Spanish Harlem to become a criminal lawyer with scores of indigent clients, and then he became an assistant district attorney and a judge, and he was elected to the Supreme Court in 1990. And he's written 3 widely read books dealing with criminal justice system, and 2 of these were merged into the movie Carlito's Way, directed by Brian De Palma. And finally, joining them at the far end is Michael Sheehan, who spent 28 years as a homicide detective in New York. He's investigated some 2,800 homicides, among them the Jennifer Levin case. He's worked as an investigative reporter for Fox 5, and he was the man who captured the famous rooftop killer. Now, turning to the writers on our platform here, we have first Joyce Carol Oates, known to you all, I'm sure, as one of America's most widely read and admired writers of fiction, short stories, essays, the author of studies of boxing and serial killers. She's written over 20 novels. The most recent of them, appropriately enough for our discussion tonight, is Foxfire, Confessions of a Girl Gang. And then we have, right near to me, a panelist who should have 2 seats, actually, because one would be for Evan Hunter, who's widely known for his book, The Blackboard Jungle, which became a famous movie with Sidney Poitier, and who went on to write other well-known novels, among them the stories that became such feature films as Strangers When We Meet, and screenplays, such as the one for Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds. And he has a most recent novel, just published, called Criminal Conversation. Now, sitting with him, or within him, if you will, is his nom de plume, Ed McBain, the author of the famous 87th Precinct novels, some 50 of which have been published. There was Cop Hater in 1956, and fairly recently there was Fuzz. The TLS once commented that McBain's stories of precinct life showed him to be almost as stern a moralist for America in the 70s as Tolstoy was for Russia in the 1900s. Now, then we have also Linda Wolfe, a journalist, novelist, well known for observations on crime in the city. Her book, Wanted, was about Robert Chambers, murder of Jennifer Levin. And this autumn, her book, Double Life, will appear. It's the story of the downfall of the New York Chief Judge Saul Waxler. Then we have, sitting next to Linda Wolfe, we have Walter Mosley. He's the author of White Butterfly and Devil in a Blue Dress, among other novels, and which have been much admired. And in these novels, he has his own detective, Mr. Easy Rowland, who assumes many disguises and many faces. He's vice president of Penn. Now, talking of Penn and for the New York Review, before we begin and turn over the evening to this judicious temperament of Murray Kempton, can I ask you to join me in thanking all these distinguished people for coming together from their different worlds tonight.
That's good.
Thank you, Bob. You've spared me a lapse from my determination to limit my remarks as much as possible. You know, listening to Monteverdi has finally persuaded me that the prologue wastes a lot of time before the opera. And I have the same impression of long preliminary discussions by moderators. Penn has prepared an agenda that seems to me perfectly suited to the purpose. But it does invite me to speculate on why people flee from crime and yet love to read about it. I shall simply reply that crime was a subject whose fascinations helped elevate Balzac, Dostoevsky, and Faulkner above most of their contemporaries, and that if it was good enough for the likes of them, it can scarcely be thought beneath the rest of us. That said, let's get to the business. We will first invite the thoughts on law enforcement of some of those who have been engaged with it as professionals. And I suspect we might begin, not the right way, we're going out. Judge Torres.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Pray tell, what is the question?
It was beautifully stated by Mr. Silver's introductory remarks.
I found
Maybe is the question, do law officers understand writers, and do writers understand politicians? I think every writer I know wants to be a cop, and every cop I know wants to be a novelist, so as far as I know. So anyway, I think what we probably are talking about is the structure and problems of law enforcement. And the attitude of the public is filtered by its writers. I made all this up on the spot. And the attitude of the public is filtered through its writers, to the extent they can filter. No, they can be said to filter. That's not really their duty. And I think how your attitudes, well, you were also a writer. That's what makes it so tough. How your attitudes differ, in a sense, when you're sitting on the bench, from what you read in novels and newspapers, always accepting your own. And is that state the question? Speaking of not talking much.
yes, in a rather roundabout fashion. Well, my life has been one of a total immersion, you might say, in certainly in the criminal justice system. I started out as an assistant district attorney in the 50s, and then I was in criminal defense practice all of the 60s and into the late 70s. And just before my appointment, my ascent to the bench, so to speak, as we say, I started writing, and I wrote 3 novels in 3 years, 75, 76, 77. And then, of course, writer's block set in. And I've been sterile ever since on that. But I have, as I said, I've been in the system so long, and I've been in the criminal court, and I've been in the Supreme Court, where I've been now close to 18 years. And yet, in consonance with what Mr. Kempton has stated here, my fascination with crime per se has never diminished. What is it Kafka says, the fascination of the condemned man? We're all fascinated by the condemned man. And notwithstanding the fact that I have an exposure beyond the common, in the sense that for instance, next Monday, I'm starting the George Cobo, Tony Lee Simpson trial, which is, of course, I'll be presiding over that. That is the case involving the murder of the Indian prince and the Chilean heiress and so forth. So cases of that stripe, you almost look forward to them. So to me, it's an inexhaustible trove of fascination, the criminal justice system. And insofar as what the respective psyches of the various criminals one encounters, there I throw up my hands. There's no delving that. And not even Dostoevsky with Raskolnikov or anything of that sort. It's even beyond that, the complexity of the human mind and the criminal mind per se. But it's endlessly fascinating. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Judge. That's a good answer to what was not terribly skillfully carpentered question. We then move on. My problem with writers is that, in a sense, I think most of them come to us in crime through journalism, and I'm not sure that journalism is always a proper literary subject, so I don't know whether we will discuss the way the newspapers cover crime or not, but it's not the same thing. But in any case, I will now ask Commissioner Condon, or should I say retired Deputy Inspector Condon, to comment.
Well, I would say a few things. One, to talk about a criminal justice system is probably to give a structure to something that really doesn't have a structure. There is a police system, there is a prosecutor's system, there's a criminal defense system, there are court systems. They intersect at various times. Very rarely are they all going in the same direction at the same time, and that's even for the people who you would presume to be on the same side. So there's not really a system. When you look at, I would say to the writers, you know, if they need comfort at all, there's probably nothing you can write that either didn't happen, or isn't happening now, or is not about to happen. I mean, Judge Torres talks about the complexity of the human mind, and he's absolutely true. And to discuss why people commit crime, there is no reason. Well, there is no single reason. There are just a myriad reasons. And what we in the police see really is part of the beginning of that process. I mean, and unfortunately for the police, unlike the other parts of the criminal justice system, we don't control intake. You know, the radio goes off in the radio car and you're on your way, or someone comes up to you on the street and you're on your way, and you really don't have any control over how much you do. And because of the nature of policing, police officers really being on their own, the police department is a very unusual structure in that the most crucial decision-making in a police department is done at the very lowest level. I mean, police officers are the people who make the decisions to shoot or not to shoot, to arrest or not to arrest. And it's strange because the whole rest of this massive bureaucracy, this structure, is really in a supportive role. And there are very few organizations where the decision-making function is at such a low level, and where those decisions are sometimes impossible to change.
Thank you, sir. There is the infantry, of course. Former police detective Michael Sheehan is a famous figure, and he's now in journalism. He's stooped to our company. And I think, you know, he has the face of the good cop in the good cop, bad cop tableau of police inquisition. I'm glad to say we couldn't get a bad cop instead. So anyway, Mike, if you have comments, I'd love to hear them.
I think really, to start off with, I must tell you, what gets a guy interested in this kind of work? What brings someone into the criminal justice system? Well, in my case, I was fascinated with detectives. As a little boy, just literally fascinated. And that was mostly from reading, but also from listening to my dad and guys in the neighborhood. Grew up here in Manhattan's Yorkville, right on the brink. Depending on which side of the street you played ball on, you were either on Spanish Harlem or Yorkville, you know. But the fascination of the characters in the neighborhood, and that fascination carried on. I did a piece, St. Patrick's Day, I believe it was St. Patrick's Day, on the good work that the New York City Police Department had been doing on a variety of cases this year. And one of the things I threw back to, I didn't have to write it, it was right from my heart. As you know, one of the first things that got me interested in police work was as a young boy sitting on a stoop up in Spanish Harlem. And we'd chip in and we'd buy, I think, the Daily Mirror, not to get into newspapers. I heed your warning. But you get the Daily Mirror, let's say, and some outrageous headline. Actually looks kind of tame in light of what we see today in our papers. But you'd have an outrageous headline about a terrible homicide somewhere in the city. And the fascination among the guys on that stoop was, how in God's name are they ever going to find this guy? This is a city of 8 million people. Naked City tells us this every night. You know, there's 8 million stories. Where are they going to get this guy? You know, where are they going to start? And I think that's what the beginning of a lot of our writers probably is the same. I mean, it's a fascination with the underbelly of the city, the fascination with the bizarre. What makes somebody do it, and then what drives a detective and the cops? How do they find this guy in a city of 8 million people? And the fascinating thing, for me at least, with 3 days after you'd see this terrible headline, there'd be another picture on all the front pages of two members of what we used to call the Beef Trust, two big beefy detectives with cigars, and they'd be dragging a guy into the station house in cuffs. How did they get this guy? Where did they get him? And it was a fascination that lasted. I was a foot patrolman in Harlem, radio car. I worked in narcotics. I was an undercover. I was lucky enough to go into the detective bureau and eventually homicide, and I found out for myself. And it's a funny thing, my entire career, some of my best friends, besides being in the job and in the criminal justice system, DAs and lawyers and judges, were also writers. And we shared this fascination, I guess straight through for about 20 some odd years, 25 years. And I guess the fascination continues, Murray, because now I'm like an ambulance chaser now. I run around with Fox News. Now I chase detectives.
Well, well, that makes a very good turn, because I have a feeling that what you talk about, the detective's instinct to be, or his fascination with the puzzle, I think is probably very like writer's fascination with the puzzle. And I think that's what makes them so interested in crime, possibly. First, Miss Joyce Carol Oates, who has lately made herself the grand mistress of the grand guignol in these matters.
I have. They'll be surprised to hear that out in Princeton. Well, maybe it's because I'm a woman, or maybe it's just my personality, but I tend to think of the phenomenon of crime from the perspective of being a victim. And when I wrote about boxing, I very much identify with losing boxers and with boxers who were failing, because somebody must address what it feels like to be the consequence of crime. And I've very often written about the consequences of violence in America. I lived for about 10 years in Detroit, so I feel that I've earned my right to now live in Princeton. This is completely antithetical to Detroit. In Princeton, the problem is just staying awake, I think, probably. I'm hoping that nobody in this room, is going to talk to anyone in Princeton. But it is a place that to live in is to experience a kind of hallucinatory peacefulness that is not characteristic of the world at large, certainly of the world of Manhattan, let's say. But as a woman and as a writer, I've very often written about the victims of violence, who happen often to be women and children. And I get into their experiences and the sort of dreaming back and the repercussions psychologically and emotionally and in terms of society. So I suppose as a writer, I'm writing about crime from a very elliptical, marginal perspective. And when I read about crime, which is fairly often, for the New York Review of Books, I read about 20 books on serial killers, and they just kept coming, Federal Express, and I was overwhelmed. I love to write for the New York Review because these books just keep coming, and I was overwhelmed. And I got to the point where it was very distressing, and I was having difficult nights, and I was dreaming about these dreadful things. Because obviously when a crime occurs, especially a crime of such enormity as serial killers' crimes, there's a feeling that no punishment is really equal to the crime. I mean, even an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, which we consider very primitive, is not, it's not operant here. These crimes far exceed any capacity for comprehension, let alone punishment, and absolutely no rehabilitation of it, just really beyond the margins. So there's a sense in all of us that some profound imbalance has occurred in the universe, and our anxieties are triggered by this. And when we read or we may see something on television, I think it's the anxiety of a kind of desire that we see the imbalance restored, that justice is somehow restored. And we really do feel a tremendous tension and stress. I got to the point where if another book on serial killers came in, I found it impossible to read a book unless I looked at the ending to see whether the serial killer had been caught. I'm not able any longer to read a book about serial killers in which the perpetrator is not caught. It just leaves me much too distressed. And this is what happens, I guess, when you review for the New York Review of Books. So I'll sort of leave it at that. Maybe we'll get back to some of these points a little later.
Mr. Mosley?
Yes. Oh.
I don't know what the question
Oh,
is, but it comes off the question of victims.
Yeah, victims. It's just interesting. Actually, two things. One thing about victims, you know, the people who are mostly the victims of violence are men, which is kind of an interesting thing to think about, you know, when you think of victims and being women. Well, certainly, I mean, yeah, men are, they beat up each other mostly. They kill each other and they destroy each other. Of course, they deserve it, so it's not so. You know, it's a thing where, you know, a lot of people kind of overlook it. They say, well, you know, yeah, right, but he was a crook. He should have been beaten. But, you know, I'm a writer, and I'm very confused about this thing. I wrote something about the criminal justice system, which is, I was looking at here, sounds suspiciously like a political tract rather than, but I'm gonna read it anyway. It's one page, and because I'm just not so good like everybody else here who's like they can talk so well. But justice really interests me. So I was glad that there was a question about the criminal justice system. And I'll say that there's no system of justice that doesn't include, in a real way, the criminal. His or her understanding of their own position in regard to their crimes and their humanity. When you have been convicted of a crime and lose your freedom, your possibility for getting justice comes into jeopardy. Others make decisions about what's right and wrong for you, and your particular circumstances lose importance in the world. With Penn, there's a writers program in the prisons, which I recently read for with a group of other writers. We read prisoners' writing. And when I was doing this, I was thinking about it, and I thought that these prisoners are in a situation that they're guilty because they were convicted and sentenced to jail. I mean, that kind of defines their guilt. But they still love their mothers, and maybe they feel that the crime that they committed has never been properly explored. They were afraid from the day that they were born, and they were afraid on the day that they took that money or they took that life. And they might feel a certain injustice toward their own humanity as in regards to being in prison. They might even resent, like, the earth for going on about its business while they're in jail. The truth, in the form of the written word, may not exonerate their crimes or free them, but at least they will have their side of the story told in their own terms. And in telling the story, they discover answers for themselves. Now, I think that this is a gesture toward justice. I don't believe that if they write about their crimes, that should exonerate them necessarily. I don't feel that if you can write about your crimes that you should be free if indeed you're guilty. But I do feel that it's a gesture toward justice that the only weapon against crime, which is in itself injustice, is understanding. And the criminal can't be left out of that understanding.
Thank you very much. Linda?
Yes, I wanted to say that I write true crime, but I came to it through fiction. And I just want to say a little bit about that before my perspective on the criminal justice system. In the 60s, early 60s, I was writing fiction and publishing in literary magazines. And I was very dissatisfied with my short stories because I felt that they didn't have an engine. I hadn't had enough life experience, nothing really had happened to me. I was looking inside myself, and the stories that I wrote were not real enough somehow. And so I started clipping stories out of the newspapers, and I used to save these clippings, which I still have, that are sort of moldering in this drawer of mine. Mysterious Death in Topeka, Kansas. This is a very good one, by the way, if there's any writer out there. There was a 1962 killing of a woman who was a patient at the Menninger Clinic, and they never found her killer. And I have a whole bunch of these things. And finally, after a while, I thought maybe I'll switch and try and write about these real things. It took a long time because at that point in the early 60s, Tom Wolfe, who's no relation of mine, I'm sorry to say, but has said that the fiction writers were the true creative people, and journalists were looked upon as a kind of lesser creature. They were merely, I think he calls them slag diggers. and they just went out and dug and brought back facts. But to be really a creative person, you had to be writing fiction. Now, as we all know, this has changed in the last 20 years. There's been a burst of wonderful journalism, I guess starting with Capote, and particularly in the area of crime, and particularly when the crime writer tries to use the tools of fiction and to think the way a fiction writer does to get inside the mind of the criminal or the victim. So I have made that transition, and part of the reason that I've been able to do what I've done has been the wonderful people that I've met in law enforcement and the criminal justice system, including Judge Torres and Mike Sheehan there. And one of the things I find as a writer on true crime is that the people in the system are incredibly helpful. They want to explain what they're doing. They want you to write about them. They want this communication with the world of readers. So it's a wonderful pursuit. And the last thing I wanted to say, if I can be a little bit flippant about the criminal justice system, is that it's really A-OK because everything opens up. If you're an investigative reporter and you're trying to find out about something in business, for example, and there's been no crime, you have a terrible time. You can't get anything. But when there's a crime, so many things become open, so many records become open, and again, there are so many people willing to talk to you. So you're way ahead of yourself.
Thank you, Leonard. Make life sound wonderful.
I didn't talk about the bad part.
Good for you. Mr. Hunter.
I'm not even sure I'm that fascinated with crime. When I first began writing, the markets opened to me as a young writer were the pulp magazines. I don't know if you're all familiar with those. They were about the size of this pad, and the covers, they were printed on this very grainy, yellowish paper that had leaves and twigs floating in it, so which is why they were called pulp, because it was pulp wood that they made it from. And the covers were usually printed in the primary colors, which are red, yellow, and blue. And usually showed a woman in jeopardy of, if it were a science fiction pulp, she was usually being threatened by a bug-eyed monster of some sort. And a detective pulp was usually an Oriental for some reason threatening her. And they were all very scantily clad, except in the romance pulps, where there was just usually a woman with a horse on the cover. But the four major categories were detective, science fiction, Western, and romance. And I was born and raised in New York. I'd never been on a horse in my life. The romance market was mostly written by women writers. In college, the science I took was geology. And it seemed easy to write about crime. It just seemed easier, and they paid a quarter cent a word for these stories. And if you used a lot of ands and thes, you could make a fortune. I think what interests me more than crime, and I'll explain this in a moment where I'm going, is change. And I think that since I've written both straight novels and crime novels, I tried to figure out what is the difference between the two. Because I feel that any good novel should be about change, something that happens to a character that causes some sort of epiphany, whether the change is insight or recognition or even the realization that the character will never change. That in itself is change of a sort. But we read the straight novel and get involved in these events, and we wait for the change that will come in the character. In the crime novel, on the other hand, The change comes at the very beginning of the novel. There is a murder. There is an aberration in the orderly flow of events, a change. And the hero or heroine comes in and tries to set that change, tries to reverse that change, tries to create order where the change has made chaos. So we stay with the crime novel where the change has already occurred, only to make certain that it will be righted again. Things will be okay at the end. We will be able to pull the covers under our noses and sleep the sleep of babes. I think that people are fascinated with crime novels because they're so terrified themselves of becoming victims. The crime novel assures them that the people who are out there committing the crimes will be brought to justice, will be apprehended, will be brought before a court, will be found guilty, and will be sent to prison. And it gives us a sense of security. It takes us away from the real crime that's in the street everywhere around us, and makes us feel safe, makes us feel that this body of laws we have created over centuries and centuries and centuries to protect ourselves from each other and also from ourselves, this body of law works. That's why we read the crime novel, I think.
Thank you, Seth. You know, there are two themes along the lot of interesting ones. There's one theme that seems to be underlying in what Walter Mosley said, and on the opposite side of what Miss Oates said. And that is the question of callousness. I take it there's Oates senses a callousness towards the victim. And Mr. Mosley, I think, besides sensing a callousness towards the victim, also senses a certain callousness toward the criminal as locked up and irredeemable. I've often thought that the character of our murderers is declining steadily year by year. I really do feel this. It's unfortunate, but I think there's also a question of callousness, and I would like to ask the law officers before we move to more disciplined thoughts, how long does it take to develop that callousness when you're in law enforcement? Because I think it seems to me almost inescapable. It's very hard for street cops, much as they'd like to be social workers, to do it, to avoid it. And I don't know how much the callousness of the society, in many ways, is to be avoided, but I do think it's a major problem in law enforcement. I'm wondering about it. How can you keep your sympathies, Judge?
Well, I liken it to a nurse or an intern, let's say, in an emergency ward. If you're going to bleed copiously for everyone that comes in, you're certainly not going to function on any level. So I would say a certain kind of crust will attach itself, at least on some level, to anyone who suffers total immersion in the system. However, I feel, certainly from a judicial standpoint, you cannot allow that experience, if you want to call it that, those experiences, sordid though they may be, and allow this callousness to over-encroach, because then you're going to make a mistake. In other words, things what you have to keep uppermost in your mind, and I'm sure and I've been in plenty of squad rooms because I was an assistant district attorney in the homicide bureau for years, and I spent a lot of nights in squad rooms with accused murderers and whatnot. And you have to keep an open mind, because things are never as they appear, including positive identifications, including the appearance of a twin brother when one has been identified. These things that you could never dream in your wildest notions could occur, have and will occur. So if you become overly callous, you're going to make a mistake. And I try to be, I certainly try to be alert to that possibility and not become cynical about the character that appear before me, because oftentimes there's not, in the middle of the proceedings, there's a certain, you turn a corner and boom, you have a new phenomena in front of you. So I think anybody, and I'm sure Mike and the commissioner will bolster me on this, when you're in law enforcement, you have to be constantly alert to that prospect. Things are never as they appear. There's always a new wrinkle, a new tone. It never ends. But I wanted to, something that Mr. Mosley alluded to, writers and that sort of symbiosis, if you will, that thing, rapport between, or fascination that writers have with criminals, particularly those of a charismatic mien or nature. And it comes to mind three salient cases. Norman Mailer's thing with Jack Abbott, and of course Selwyn Rabb's campaign on behalf of Reuben Hurricane Carter was one of my favorite fighters. But to this day, I'm not, I certainly am not, don't doubt his guilt. And of course Buckley with Edgar Smith. And invariably, that's almost a tradition now where certain, I don't know if you ever became allied with any particular defendant. I guess I don't recollect that.
I root for them, but I don't trust them.
Exactly. And I remember Edgar Smith after William Buckley, who presumably of rightist tinge, the way Buckley labored so long on behalf of poor Edgar and finally extricated him. As soon as Edgar got out, he killed another woman. Okay?
Kidnapped her.
Yeah. And I have it's history. I'm not telling tales out of scripture. I have tremendous respect for Norman Mailer as a great novelist, one of our great novelists of our time, of course, and as a personality and a human being. But I have a distinct recollection of seeing Norman in the throes of the law when he was arraigned in AR2 after he almost dispatched Miss Morales in the West 90s with a kitchen knife. So perhaps some of that attached itself when he came to take the cudgels up for Mr. Jack Abbott, who not only dispatched that promising young Cuban playwright at the Binney Barn because he didn't point him in the proper direction. Before that, he had dispatched two other guys in the joint, if you can use that in this context. And, Mr. Mailer just like, he was, what's the phrase? He was attracted, but he was like infatuated with this guy. And I find that a turnoff sometimes.
But that's not what I'm saying, and that's not what I was trying to say.
No, I am not, it just came to my mind, these instances of these alliances.
But you see, very often there's a confusion, like when one becomes liberal in an approach to what's going on in prison, like when I was reading for these prisoners, I wasn't saying, well now, and I think they should all be let out because look how good this writing is.
Oh no.
But it's the recognition of writing as a tool to be a concept of expressing your own life in the world. Whatever works out, whether you stay in prison, whether you get out, that's not really my issue.
Absolutely.
My issue is just to use yourself as to coming toward justice, because it's easy once you've been committed to a crime to lose all rights and to lose all sense of justice and to forget all things about them, which is just the one thing that I wanted to say, that because it's very hard. You say, well, now, because I know after I talk, all these people come to me and say, well, my son's in jail and I think he should be out. But that's not the thing that I'm interested in. I'm more interested in the thing of people trying to obtain justice. We're trying to obtain justice being on the outside, putting people in jail. But the people in jail are also trying to obtain justice for themselves. However they try to do that, I want to support that to the degree that it fits within the law.
If I may interject, I don't want to overextend my welcome here, but along those lines, on a positive side, I know and I've become acquainted with the great actor Charles Dutton. And he, of course, I saw him in his unforgettable performance in the piano lesson, which is one of the greatest performances I've seen on the Broadway stage. And here's a man who was involved in 2 homicides, and yet was able to extricate himself. And I remember his relating, it was through the arts that he was able to rise above, what had been such an unfortunate background. So there is hope, clearly.
I think the interesting thing about jails and squad rooms and prisons around the country, I've been in a lot of them, I've never met anyone accused of anything who did it.
Yes.
They're all innocent.
There's more criminals running around this town when the wrong guy was put there in his place.
I think that writers are
but you
quite sentimental.
But you have to be alert to that possibility.
I think writers are
still
sentimental
extant at
about
all
criminals.
times.
And I
the
think
possibility of innocence, as I say, is always extant in any situation.
Oh, of course.
Because when you're in a squad room, things can break down. Am I right, Mike? Things can break down very rapidly.
just want to add to that, like any detective worth his salt in this country, who has a theory and locks himself into the theory, and then let's say the guy gets transferred or he retires, whatever. The next detective who comes in now, let's say the case is still open, he picks up that case, which should read, by the way, like a novel. It should read that way. The worst thing that I've ever seen among the police is like the above exited, the perpetrator. I mean, look, you try to read that, especially on a stand, read somebody else's work to a jury who wants, they're there to be entertained. They want to know. It's true. They want to know exactly what happened, and you're giving them all of this, and therefore, and the undersigned. I always wrote in the first person. I had some bosses that didn't care for that, but today, myself and Ed Torres went into 117 East 119th Street, and we spoke to Maggie Gonzalez on the first floor. She told us her son wasn't home, but that he left his gun in the top drawer, and Papo borrowed it last night. I mean, and if you read like that, I think you come across better. It's more credible. But now, getting back to locking himself in, when you pick up that case folder, if everything you read was created, every piece of paper was created by that detective who says that this guy, I'm positive this guy did it, and this is why he did it, et cetera, the crust, as we spoke about before, becomes really apparent. He gets sucked into this, and you're going off on a totally wrong tangent. You might have a total, a guy that no one ever even looked at is the suspect.
So the initial cop's view of it will carry down to the subsequent cops investigating?
I'm talking about the initial investigator. Let's say if you have one investigator who puts a lot of his time into a case, the worst thing that you can do as an investigator is to get locked in. You must keep an open mind, as the judge says.
But will his view prevail down the line?
Hopefully not, if he's going to be one of those guys who locks himself in.
Unless he's right.
Yeah, that's true, Chris.
I remember once going to a very distinguished police lieutenant, whose name I will not go into, during the Son of Sam case. And he was in charge of the investigation, and he explained to me at great length that all the references to the devil in this serial killer's letters meant that he was a parochial school graduate, and he was pursuing that line. And of course it turned out to be David Berkowitz, who graduated from nothing. And there was a murder in the Diamond District, and I saw him entering to take over the investigation, and I thought, no, because I don't want any close readings of the Hashidi Code to come into this investigation. But they caught the man anyway, so, people don't always are wrong. But Judge Torres says one more thing I'd like to say. I do talk too much. But I think you exaggerate the power of the written word. Jack Abbott did not get out of prison because Norman Mailer endorsed him. He got out of prison by turning in 5 guys. Which meant that he did not very much want to go back to Oklahoma, wherever it was, and serve his time there. But I do think that, you give us too much credit. And I don't think what Norman didn't identify with the act.
You don't think Selwyn Rabb's 15 years, was it, or 20 years of articles and the pressure of the Times did not culminate in the retrial, and then the reconviction, and then the thing continued anyway? You don't think that was a factor?
It was a factor, but I would like to say one more thing before I shut up. When I was on the World Telegram with Selwyn Rabb, he got interested in the case of a man named George Whitmore.
Ah, yes.
And I went over to the DA's office, and I said, Selwyn, I'm older than you are. You're off on the wrong track. This was a rape murder case. So I went over to the DA's office, and he said, look, we don't generally do this, but you're a nice person. I'll let you read the confession. I read the confession, was thoroughly persuaded, went back and said, Selwyn, if you had read that confession, you'd know this man was guilty. Selwyn didn't listen to me. It was exposed as a phony confession. When I read it, after it had been exposed as phony, it's like a, it's like a forged painting. as soon as you know it's a forgery, you just recognize the lines of forging. And so in that sense, you know, I'll forgive
That was a
Selwyn a lot of mistakes.
Wiley-Hofford case.
The Wiley-Hofford case. I'll forgive Selwyn a lot of mistakes because he was right in that case and I was completely wrong. And so I don't, I think there's a lot, you know, a lot of very good work is done. And there is a statute of limitations on Norman's domestic dispute. Sorry, Judge.
I think the statute's been told.
Does anyone, you all are doing so much better than I am, do you have anything to say? I would like to find out about law officers getting callous, not because it means they make mistakes, but because it means they've lost their humanity, which seems to me terribly important to a law officer. Not that you ever lost yours, Judge.
God forbid.
What do you think, Commissioner, about how you can keep cops from being callous?
Well, I have a few thoughts about it. One is that we sometimes confuse callousness with the fact that, and it's actually to the benefit of the police officers, that you have something to do. And having something to do allows you not to stand around and weep or be sad or if you want to see a lack of callousness, go up to a hospital some night when a police officer has been shot and everyone from that precinct is in there and they don't have anything to do. And then you will see that callousness, that crust is sort of peeled away a little bit and they're exposed to having the same emotions that everyone else does. Like in a family, when someone dies, there's someone in the family who makes arrangements for the funeral, who starts calling the relatives, who does all of these semi-necessary things, you know. And that's the hard person in the family, that's the callous person in the family, and everyone else has the ability and the luxury to sort of weep, you know, and
be sorry for
and to be sorry. So, you know, I'm not sure that that the callousness, the crust is as thick as we might think it is.
How about yours?
Mine?
Yours is fine. I was asking Mike about his, because he's now in television, and
Okay.
that really breeds it.
Now I've turned callous. Now I'll learn how to tell a story in 2 minutes. That's callous. Especially for an Irishman. No, but it is impossible. You know, I've taken over 1,000 homicide confessions, and the callous guy is not going to get that confession, you know. Contrary to all this popular belief, the rubber hose and all that stuff, and you better tell us, or that doesn't work. You know, maybe the criminal today is too well educated. I don't know. They certainly know their rights. And although many of them waive their right to an attorney, they have this impulse to speak, to tell their story, which leads them down the path to the confession. And in many cases, thank God, from a police point of view, because there was no physical evidence, et cetera, at the case. And the Chambers case is a prime example. Without that confession, I doubt whether he'd be upstate today, you know?
You know, someone told me that there are more confessions now than there were before Miranda.
It's amazing.
Well, I wouldn't doubt it. And one of the greatest tools from a cop's point of view, especially now on the heels of all this scandal, very difficult to get a jury to believe you. I remember after the Knapp Commission, you'd walk in and say, I gave the rights, and the defense attorney would go into his theatrical mode, and he'd look at the jury and go, yeah, like, yeah, you believe that, right? You know, and the greatest thing in the world, we used to do it with a stenographer. I remember, sure, in your day, with a stenographer. The greatest thing in the world is now you could sit there and you go, his rights were violated. His rights were infringed upon. Look at this poor youth. For instance, example, the jogger case. Well, yeah, well, let's go to the videotape. All right? Here's Mommy and Daddy sitting with Junior as he describes what he did to a young woman who was semi-conscious, you know. The videotape today is probably the greatest tool for law enforcement. But it's an amazing thing. Even you'd think that they would have these discussion groups in prison. So like, hey, did you talk to the cops? Yeah. Stupid move, huh? Dumb. You know. But they don't do that. They don't do that. And it's it really is, it's an amazing phenomenon. Even
Mike, I've been wondering about that. I've never understood how when you tell the guy, you know, you start reading his rights, that he then doesn't clam up. What is the thing that...
A lot of them think that they can rationalize. In Robert Chambers' case, he thought he was smarter than every detective there. You know,
Excuse me, if I may interject. Sure. There's also, from my experience in Homicide Bureau, there's also the purging catharsis factor. When you apprehend an individual fresh on the heels of this, like, you know, he stabbed, like I've had, you know, 70 stab wounds. There's a period there, I think Michael corroborate this, maybe 24 hours when they want to talk about it. They want to get it off their chest, literally.
It's the Raskolnikov.
Exactly. I want to touch on something that occurs to me because he's ailing at this point. I know Mike knows him very well. It shows you how fortunate we are to have in our midst police officers of the quality of a guy like, let's say, a guy like Vince Hefferon, who was a lifelong friend of mine, who was the half of the famous Mutt and Jeff team in the 2-3 in Harlem. And I've written of his exploits in many, you know, inferentially in many areas. And a movie was made about Vince, in essence called Madigan. And then Richard Widmark played that role. So that the real Vince, okay, and his exploits, which I know of at first hand in the 2-3, are beyond anything any fiction writer could create, okay? And notwithstanding, this is an Irishman, former heavyweight champion of the European theater in World War II. I'm talking about am I talking about a tough guy? Huh. And yet, so compassionate, so humane, so liberal this very day that he and I more or less at loggerheads on many issues of this sort. And so you have this juxtaposition of an individual who, notwithstanding the exposure, the 25 years in the heat of the mean streets, okay, and still can maintain that humanity and that concern for his fellow man. And we have those guys. We have them on the job. And I thought I'd just say that for whatever it's worth.
Well, now, we have here 4 writers who have examined the criminal line and known criminal types over a long period of interest. Does each of you have some discovery about what makes criminals that has struck you as particularly useful?
Well, while my fellow panelists were speaking, I was thinking how in my own lifetime, I haven't really known any criminals, but I've known so many victims. And I guess it's sort of a macho thing to identify with the perpetrator, who tends to often be male. And I was surprised at what Walter said, though I'm sure he's correct, that most victims of violence are actually men. We think of women and children being abused and battered, raped, murdered in this country in alarming degrees. And I don't have the statistics at my fingertips, you know, to quote them, but they really are astounding. The degree of violence perpetrated against women and against children. Anyway, my background is sort of working class, or maybe below working class. I come from upstate New York in a very rural community, and this is some time ago, and I won't embarrass myself by saying how many decades ago, but there was a good deal of crime going on of a domestic violence type. And it's possible, or even quite probable, that these crimes were not so defined then, and they were not reported to any police. But I lived in a world where men worked in factories or they were unemployed or on strike, but never in control of their lives and as earners or breadwinners of a family. I mean, they might have to go out on strike, or they might just be laid off. And so it was a world in which the economy was very precarious, and the men did a lot of drinking, both in my own family and in the you know, our neighbors and so forth. And a man would get drunk, and he would go after his family. We would hear screams from next door. My father would go next door and try to help the, the children or the wife who was being threatened with a butcher knife. He would himself being threatened by being punched, And none of this, I think, was ever reported to the police. And at the time, nobody would have said the man who got drunk and beat up his children and wife was a criminal. But yet today, we would say that this is a crime, and he would be, I hope, he would be reported. So the statistics today are in, they're different from what they used to be. And at the very beginning of my own life, even before I was born, my life was determined by an act of murder. My grandfather was murdered, and because of that, my mother, who was the youngest of about 9 children in a very poor farm family, had to be given away. I'm not telling any secrets. I've actually written about this, but I've written about it in much in a context of language. I feel I'm blushing because I'm speaking kind of awkwardly and falteringly now, and it's not a family secret. But my whole life and my mother's life and everything subsequent to that was really deflected by an act of murder. But nobody would ever talk about it in my family. I learned about it when I was an adult. It's just that we always had the consequences of it. And we lived in a world in which I went to a one-room schoolhouse, and as I say, it was a very impoverished part of the world. And there were definitely acts of what we call sexual harassment would have been a luxury in that world. The things that went on, and we would hear about acts of incest that these boys would be boasting that they had forced their younger sisters into doing. So as I said earlier, my identification, it's a very involuntary sympathy, is with the victims, but I would like to make the victims individuals and show that they have their own personalities and their anger and integrity. They're not flat, two-dimensional cartoon figures who are just sort of on the floor, and of no interest, while the perpetrators are these macho characters that Norman Mailer would be infatuated with. I don't find the Jack Abbotts of the world so mesmerizing, and I read a lot about serial killers, a lot more than I needed to read, I think. I don't find them fascinating. I think many of their victims who've survived have been extraordinarily courageous. I wrote a novel called Blackwater, which is a fictionalized version of the Chappaquiddick incident of July 1969, and one might say there was a U.S. senator who committed some criminal acts, and nobody seemed to care much at all about the victim who drowned or suffocated to death in the overturned car beneath the surface of the water, while the senator was conferring with his lawyers and so forth. I think about 12 hours went by before it was reported.
I think you're absolutely right.
Can I say, excuse me, can I say something apropos of this victimization? I can assure you, Ms. Oates, that certainly in the courtrooms I know of, speaking certainly for myself, and I think I'm representative of most of us, of the jurists, and certainly in this county, in this city, we're very mindful and ever attuned to the 2,200 murders that we have on an average in this city. We're approaching the 3,000 mark. When I started in the Homicide Bureau in 1958, we had 250 thereabouts, okay, with a population of 9 million. Now we're down to 7 million, 7.5 million, and we're up to 2,200, okay?
It's incredible.
But I can say to you that, for instance, in the Watkins case, I don't remember the 8 defendants individually by name. I can cite them, but I wouldn't. But I always remember the Watkins case, this young boy, Brian Watkins, okay, who was murdered on the subway, set upon by 12. We got 8 of them. And he was here for the tennis matches, and he was killed on the subway on 51st Street on the platform with the... So I have something emblazoned in my mind, and it's ineradicable. And I saw the father of Brian Watkins on the witness stand, and he was compelled or constrained to testify. 8 times he had to relive under cross-examination the murder of his child right in front of him, stabbed through the heart. And at one interval, and a venerable man, a saintly man who had no malice toward the accused, when I would have been, as a father, would have vault off and grab him by the throat, okay? But this man At one juncture, he looked up at the ceiling in the midst of his testimony after he'd been back and forth over this, reliving it, and he just almost beseechingly to the heavens, God, why didn't you take me? Why did you take my son? Because you can imagine the helplessness you feel to have your son slain before your very eyes. Okay? Believe me, there were tears in my eyes, and I was a presiding justice. See? So we sense and we feel for the victims. Please don't think otherwise.
Well, I think Miss Oates' artistic judgment that the girl was somehow more interesting in and of herself than the institutions that obliterated her, which is, I think, what you were talking about. I think that it just shows your good judgment as a novelist, more than your sense of victims, because I think it's absolutely the most interesting question. The Capectis are more interesting than the Kennedys.
But you know, in a good mystery novel, really finding out what the victim was all about is what leads to uncovering the murderer. So that the very process, the unfolding of a mystery novel, is learning all about the victim, who the victim was, what she or he did. Incidentally, Joyce, I must take exception. In many of my novels, these big macho killers are women.
Oh, that's because you're a man.
I also would take exception by suggesting that chivalry isn't all that gone in Western civilization. I hate macho men. Whenever I'm ever hugged by one of them, I wonder what girls could possibly see in it. But I also think suspect that the old question, when did you stop beating your wife, was first asked by a man. Of course, he was sober at the time, but... Mr. Mosley?
Yeah, maybe I'll be kind of crusty on this. I have two answers to what creates a criminal. I don't really answer it, and they're not quite together. But the first one is, as a writer, I just approach the question formally. A crime occurs when my actions, according to my sense of right and wrong, disagrees with yours. That's my child. That's my money. Because I earned it, because I can take it, because I need it more than you do, because I can't help myself, because it pleases me to see my power over you. It is, and it's very simple, it's very formal. You know, the idea of trying to come into a moral or ethical understanding as a writer seems useless to me, because it disintegrates writing. The second, I think of Bill Sykes, you know, and Charles Dickens, Bill Sykes, because I remember one of the best things. I love Dickens, and when he describes, you know, rather than going through this long social thing about Sykes, he says, Sykes' first memory was wandering down a road, and he was hungry and looking for something to steal. He didn't remember his parents. He didn't remember his fluffy rabbit doll. He remembered desperation and the conviction to survive, period. He was not a nice man. Crime is relative to the society in which you find yourself. If you and your best friend are living in a cold water flat and you're hungry, the miraculous appearance of a 5-pound ham won't be questioned, at least not morally or ethically. Maybe you ask about it to see where you can get another 5-pound ham. Crime, I think, is always a betrayal. And it's a betrayal in this sense. It bites the hand that feeds you. You know, if it's not doing that, it's not wrong, at least by the people who you're surrounded by. Somebody else might think it's wrong, but that's them. I, on the other hand, don't think it was wrong. Well, yeah, he killed him, right? Well, he should have killed him. Yeah, he didn't mess around with his wife. He should have killed him, right? You know, and you have this thing, and you understand it when people can accept people who they know who are doing things that other people define as crimes. I don't define it as a crime. So, well, listen, that's what I would do. And this is just the way that I understand the making of a criminal. It's kind of like when all of a sudden you're displaced in another world. You find yourself in Indiana, for instance. And, you know, so, anyway.
Thank you again. Linda?
Well, you asked what we had learned about the criminal in the course of our writing, and I've met quite a few criminals over the last 10 years or so. Not so much street criminal. I met them too, but the ones that are interesting to me are the sociopaths and the psychopaths, and I've encountered quite a few of them, Robert Chambers being one, and several others that might be less famous but that have had some attention. And what I've noticed, first I read about sociopaths in psychological works, and I learned that you can't really tell them that they're charming, that everything is masked and concealed. And then I started meeting a whole bunch of them. Chambers, a fellow named Fishman that was tried in Judge Torres' court, the quintessential psychopath who considered himself a poet and had attempted to murder his wife. And was just as happy. I mean, he was always happy. He was always pleased with himself and utterly charming, and always trying to convince me how this whole thing had been a setup. And one after another. And the thing that really gets to me, that troubles me about writing about crime, is that I can't tell. I mean, when I meet these people, they're usually they're most seductive. And there's no way that I can tell at all that they have committed a crime, would be capable of committing a crime. And I feel that writers are sentimental about criminals. They have been pretty much since the 19th century, and when criminality was something done for a 5-pound ham or Jean Valjean kind of crime. But now we've got killers who just don't look at you as a person because they're so pleased and into themselves. And most of these people are very narcissistic. And
well, Linda, to pick up on that,
it's frightening. It's just terrifying.
To pick up on that, one of the things about Ted Bundy that was so particularly excruciating and painful is that as his career went into gear, let's say, he was not identified, but there was a serial killer, and he got all this attention in the press, and he loved it. Yes. And Anne Rule, in her classic book, The Stranger Beside Me, she makes the point that there was a point in his career where he was doing the crimes almost as much for the publicity and for leading the detectives on a merry chase, and the media are
the media builds
a frenzy. It's a romance of crime.
But I have to say that in answer to the question, I mean, it's funny because you see, it's a thing like convicting somebody of a crime and then like saying, well, now that they don't have any rights because they did this crime. I'm answering, and I think, and this is how the question is: what creates a criminal, not what creates a psychopathic murderer. If I were only talking about psychopathic murderers, I might have to think about this more. But I mean, there's all kinds of criminals, and there's all kinds of crime, and there's all kinds of reasons behind it. And not all people who commit crimes, which I think a lot of people believe, like what you're saying, all people who commit crimes are psychopathic or sociopathic. And of course, that's nonsense. A lot of people commit crimes for, reasons. It's like in daily life. Well, we work for this place, but, if we just take a couple of televisions off this truck and sell them, we'll have enough money to blah, blah, blah. I'm not trying to say this is right, but I'm saying, well, but this isn't a sociopath who took these televisions off this truck. And so what you're trying to do is saying, well, let's talk about murderers. And this is a very specific, branch of crime.
We're talking about different
right, and we're talking about criminals, talking about writing crime fiction, and crime fiction, has a much broader range than this idea of, sociopathic murderers, I think.
Sorry.
No, it's your.
I think we really get to the heart of the matter here when we're talking about the nature of crime and the so-called criminal mind. And I think that this is part of the reason I choose in half of my creative life to write about crime and criminals. Aside from the fact of being terrified, I think writing about crime is one way of dealing with one's own fear of crime and one's fear of being attacked. I visualize myself sitting in a bar, minding my own business, drinking my Pink Lady, and 6 guys are drinking beer and they're going to beat me up. So I write about crime in order to deal with that and my constant fear of being victimized. But part of trying to understand why people do these strange things, why someone will go into a mom-and-pop grocery store with a gun in his fist, knowing there's $50 in the cash register that he may get, and knowing equally well that he's looking at 20 years in prison. That's what he's looking at down the line if he gets caught. I don't know why he would do that. I don't know why, if someone is having trouble with his wife and feels the marriage isn't working, why he wouldn't consider separation or divorce. Why he would think, I think I'll kill her.
He's too emotionally involved.
Well, the answer is that there's no sense of tomorrow, I think, in people who commit crimes like that. They're acting impulsively, and they're not organized in the same way that you and I are. So they're not thinking about what is the next step. They're reacting to the situation.
I remember years and years ago, they used to have lineups in New York City, not for purposes of identification the way we have them now, but to acquaint the working detectives in each precinct with the people who were committing felonies in this city. So detectives would draw lineup duty every week, and they'd go downtown to headquarters of the big gymnasium, and the chief of detectives would sit there and bring out the people committing the crimes, and they'd look them over. And I remember this was so shocking to me. They brought out this one woman, and the chief of detectives was talking to her, and he said, well, what happened there? What happened with, do you know that your husband was very seriously injured? And she said, yes. And he said, well, can you tell us what happened? And she was a very thin, frail-looking woman, and she said, I was watching television, and he came in and turned the channel. She said, and I went into the bathroom, and I spied a hatchet, and I brought it back in and hit him with it. And he said, do you know how many times you hit him? He said, yes, I hit him. I don't know, a lot of times. He said, you hit him 37 times, Virginia. Her name was Virginia. You hit him 37 times. He said, do you know her condition? She said, no, I don't. He said, he's dead. So this, to her, was a perfectly reasonable solution for this man,
Yes.
having turned the channel. In that case, here's a hatchet, I might as well kill him.
Evan,
There had to be a history there.
Evan, I had occasion to meet a murderer who had murdered his wife, and so let's not leave this with the woman taking the axe. This fellow had murdered his wife, and his reason, as he explained it, was that she'd asked him to go out and buy a bottle of milk when he'd come home from looking for work. He was unemployed, he'd been out looking for work all day. The baby was screaming, he came home, and it was just too, that asking him to go for the bottle of milk was just too much, and he got the kitchen knife and stabbed her. So this is what I mean about the suddenness of it. They're not considering the connection between.
But why is it a viable solution? Is it in the nature of the beast?
It's getting rid of the irritation.
No, Evan, excuse me. These are mentally unbalanced people. I mean, these are not college professors. I'm very good friends with a public defender, and she had worked in Trenton for many years. And my friend, this public defender, she said that virtually all her clients are mentally disturbed people. And you're projecting yourself in that. You're saying, why doesn't this man go and get Rail Feld or as a divorce attorney or someone, to help him with his divorce? No, they don't. Well, Linda said they don't think. There's no concept of the future, and they are just governed by their
But then insanity would be a reasonable defense in any murder, no?
They're
all
disturbed. They're disturbed, but they're not
Well,
schizophrenic.
insane and disturbed are different.
Well, there's
I'm
got
not
to be a
schizophrenic.
history.
Jeffrey
I mean,
Dahmer.
he
Yeah,
must have
there's a
crossed her
history.
once before.
Many times.
Right, yeah.
I mean, her will could not have commanded that household. I mean, that's why you have novels.
Right.
May I say this? It occurs to me, as with Linda's allusion to the Clifford Fishman case, there is no field of human endeavor that provides as much grist for the literary mill as crime. I mean, I've written 3 novels, and I don't think I've ever coined out of whole cloth a line of dialogue. Somebody has said something that I've written somewhere. And you could not duplicate. Just in an everyday course of events in a courtroom, you hear exchanges and colloquies which are beyond. I mean, you just, I remember when I sentenced Nookie Sweeper in a murder case. He said, well, you know, everything to say in mitigate. He said, well, I had to do what I had to do. Yeah, right. And I said to him, okay, Nookie, now I got to do what I got to do, 20 to 5 to life. You know, I mean, you have these exchanges. I was trying a case with the famous Silver Gun Bandit. And the renowned Enid Gerling, very famous criminal defense lawyer, and she kept calling the defendant, whose name was, it was spelled D-I-R-T-O-N, and I used to call him Dirton. Okay, this was the famous Silver Gun Bandit, rapist, whatever, robber, Bert, and she kept calling him Ditron, and I kept saying Dirton, and she said Ditron, and then she said, and we went into this Cole Porter exchange right in front of the jury. Because she says, you say tomato, then I said, I say tomato. Then she said, you say potato, I say potato. Let's call the whole thing off. We went through this thing. I mean, you couldn't invent these things. I mean, but apropos, I'll give you an example, the Cliff Fishman that she alluded to. Here's a guy, this is the complexity, inexplicability, if there's such a word, of the criminal mind. Here's a guy who was a real estate developer, a very polished gentleman with a fine apartment in Jersey, in the Palisades and whatnot, and he goes to the South Bronx. He has to extinguish his beautiful, charming wife, who is a school teacher. She teaches at Trinity, and she's a very close friend of the renowned District Attorney Linda Fasting, because they went to school together. And he's got to rub her out. He's got to whack her out, because she wants to divorce him, and he doesn't want to pay for this. So he goes to the South Bronx, and he retains the most bedraggled crew of Puerto Rican hitmen you've ever seen. And they come down to whack Mrs. Fishman out, and they bring three, as they call them, 3 chicks with them as sightseers, as tourists.
Yeah.
And they converge, because he's giving them explicit instructions how to follow the car from Jersey across to GW, get off over here at 72nd, where she gets off. She puts it in the garage, and then she walks to Trinity in the West 90s. So then, of course, he jumps on a plane, he flies to Florida, being Florida by the time they take the old lady out. Meanwhile, the first day they lose her on the GW bridge the first day. Second day, they lose her in the garage. And the third day, they lose her en route to the school. So by this time, Fishman's back in town, and they still haven't rubbed the wife out. So then they decide to shoot her in front of the school. They're waiting for her. She's got a styrofoam cup of coffee in her hand, and she's getting into the school. She's got her earrings and her watch. So the first guy, this first shooter, if you want to call it, jumps out of the car with the automatic. He starts blasting away. It knocks the watch off her wrist, deflects off her skull, and all the rest of the bullets miss her. Okay, she has the presence of mind, which even Mike wouldn't have under the circumstances. She, as she related, she bent down after they fled in the car and picked up all of the cartridges from the automatic. She said there might be evidence later on in the case. Remember that? And I'm listening to this, and I say, you couldn't make this up in a month of, okay? Am I right, or am I exaggerating?
Right. And then the story of their relationship, you couldn't possibly you couldn't make this up. Do you remember that he had picked her up in Zabar's? They were standing on the line, and he noticed this charming young woman. She was considerably younger than he was, and he started talking to her and telling her that he was buying lox and bagels to have a brunch with his children, and would she care to come? And she said, well, I don't normally have anything to do with strangers, and he said, but I'm having my 3 children, which is how this woman came to become involved with this crazed murderer. And
attempted murderer.
Attempted murderer, excuse me.
But he was scouring the streets of the South Bronx.
Then he wrote poetry, and she was an English teacher.
Attempted
and he began writing poetry.
But he was scouring the South Bronx,
Yes,
and he would stop anyone he would spot on any corner and solicit them as hitmen. You see, this was going around. It was, no, here comes that clip.
But the fact is, the imagination cannot.
No, you can't.
As many writers have known. I mean, if you look at the number of books that, wonderful books that have been based on real things, that Dostoevsky used a true French crime for Crime and Punishment. Yeah. He didn't make up that guy who thought maybe he was better than the two women and he deserved to live and they didn't deserve to live. That had actually happened in France about 20 years before Dostoevsky wrote the book.
But he certainly improved a rather coarse anecdote. You know, we're being so entertained and enlightened that we've been here now for an hour and a half, and one thing I didn't do in my indisciplined way was to find out how long this program was supposed to be. And whether or not there should be, I have to turn to the chairman for this, whether or not there should be questions from the audience. You think it's time for questions? I'm terribly sorry.
Or have we overstayed our welcome?
Oh, no, you all have been magnificent. But anyway, I thought the audience ought to have a shot at you, see if you were still as magnificent. There's a microphone here and microphone there. And address how you please, as far as I can see, either one of the panelists or the whole panel.
This question is mostly to the whole panel, although the law enforcement officials are welcome to answer. With regard to Richard Price's use in the book Clockers, I don't know if anyone read it.
Clockers.
Right. The nicknames that the police officers have are given to them by the drug dealers. And with regard to the title of a book that was written in Massachusetts in the 1980s called The Cops Are Robbers, and the recent arrests in Harlem, I was wondering if either the writers or the police officials wanted to address the interrelationship between criminals and police.
Well, yeah. As far as nicknames, okay?
Let's take the hard question.
Well, you spoke about Vince Heffernan, who happened to be one of the inspirations for me becoming a New York City police officer. He's certainly one of my heroes. He worked with a guy named Frank Malherbe. They were
Martin Jeff.
They were a legend up in Spanish Harlem, and they were very good friends of my dad, who just happened to own a saloon. And
an Irishman?
An Irishman. And I would listen to their stories, and that's one of the things that fascinated me. They had a variety of nicknames depending on what block they went on. I was kind of shocked. I did most of my career in Harlem, and I was kind of shocked when I found out that my nickname among not so much the drug dealers, but among the people in the street, the numbers men and everybody who basically could control every block, was Mikey Green Eyes. And that's how they would relate, you know. I mean, that's how you got that name. And the street people would basically name a lot of guys. I mean, there's all kinds of funny names. You know, a lot of cops didn't want to own up to them, you know. I had a partner who had a very large head. And in the street, they called him the Globe. So, yo, man, the Globe.
Mikey, Mikey, with your customary adroitness, you have gotten us off the question, which was raised many years ago by Balzac on the symbiosis between policemen and criminals.
They're joined at the hip.
So they are.
I've seen that all the time. I've seen policemen who seem more at ease and comfortable with thieves than they do with a guy who comes off the street to report a crime.
May I add a third factor, a new one here? Criminal lawyers also, unfortunately. Yeah. You have a similar problem with criminal members of the bar who practice criminal law, who become infatuated with their clients, and then there's a sort of confusion of identity. I don't want to go into detail, but the initials are Bruce Cutler and Johnny Gotti. There's an example.
Judge, they're getting paid. They're getting paid. The fraternity with criminals is an aesthetic pursuit for cops, I hope, most of the time. But, yeah, well, it's right. I mean, there's no... listen, Gotti made Cutler a very big man. And without Gotti, his life is empty. Although he's still a very good advocate.
Those two guys down on the floor.
But there's no free lunch. He's spending a lot of sleepless nights with what is afoot.
Don't go around disbarring lawyers.
No,
please.
no, perish forbid. I love Bruce, but I can relate to you that his dad, who I know from the 50s when he was a cop, when he was a detective, Murray, he said to me that he had advised Bruce to throttle down, you see, and this relationship. But I myself was practiced criminal law for 20 years. And I mean, and I grew up, unlike Bruce, who probably was from a different milieu. I grew up in Spanish Harlem. I ran with these guys. I mean, I ran with Crazy Willie, Spanish Raymond, etc. All of these guys as a kid. And then some of them later on I represented and so forth. So there's always a tremendous temptation, because they'll come to your office and they'll say, hey, what do you got here? I'm going to set you up in a new office. Why are you driving a Ford? I got 3 Cadillacs. You know, you have to keep them at arm's length. And many criminal lawyers, unfortunately, and I know 3 criminal lawyer friends of mine who've been assassinated over the years for this type of overexposure. But there is this fascination with you know about it, Mike, the criminal mind. And some guys don't know how to draw the line. They go over the line. That's all she wrote.
Just to end that, I mean, the obvious thing is with a police officer is you fall into that scandal, and,
exactly,
like we're seeing today. You cannot befriend them. I mean, it's great to know guys if you go out to solve a homicide and you know who's taking numbers in the block, and you can go and talk to the guy and say, listen, man, you know, come back and give us some information. That's a great relationship. But when the guy calls you up and says, hey, listen, I got this club, you know, you ought to come down and meet me, and we should have dinner, then you have to draw the line. You say, excuse me, I have to go home and change the channels on my television. But first, I must hide the axe.
Well, I mean, the great rule of journalism is you can have lunch with a mobster, but if you see him after dark, that's social, and then he has every right to think that you're a co-conspirator, and if you betray him, he'll hit you. But I don't know. I think we got. Let's see. Was that question answered?
Yes.
Satisfactorily? Fine. Thank you.
Could we alternate sides?
She wants it.
You don't mind waiting, do you? Thank you, ma'am. You're a great lady.
Mr. Torres remarked about an increased ratio of crime to population in New York. Joyce Carol Oates talks about the fact that much of what went on in her childhood would now perhaps be considered criminal. We know that we don't have enough prison space for what's going on. Is there more crime? Is there more reported on the media? Could people address our experience that this is a much more violent society with increased criminal acts? Is that the case?
One cop, one writer.
Okay.
Condon, what do you think about this?
Is it a more violent society? I don't think there's any question about that. I think the number of homicides, for example, in New York City, in relation to the population, speaks for itself. And if you start to factor in some esoteric things like the fact that people who get shot and stabbed are not as likely to die today as they were in years before, so you're decreasing the people who actually die as a result of violence compared to what might have happened 20 years ago, 10 years ago. Police officers now all wear bulletproof vests. Many police officers are shot now and do not die who would have died 5 years ago when they didn't. It wasn't required for them to wear bulletproof vests. Other crime, property crime, there's more property. Auto theft was probably not a great problem during the Depression, because there weren't that many automobiles to steal. Now, everyone has, I mean, I remember growing up, if someone parked the car on the street where we were playing ball, you would ask them to move it down the block so that they wouldn't interfere with the field, and people would do it. And now, if you can find a place to walk between the parked cars, so the amount of property that's available to be stolen is just tremendously increased, and violence has increased fourfold, tenfold. I don't know, but it has increased.
Mr. Mosley, do you have a comment on that? The increase in violence.
Los Angeles. That's not Los Angeles.
No, I want to talk about LA. I don't know. I don't know the answer. You know, Joyce was saying before that that I write a lot about race, which I don't. But my characters are all black. Like me, white people write about race, but they write about white people, and that's not race. But I don't know, the black experience in America is so interesting. I think that there's a lot of crime that doesn't happen, that used to happen. But you see, I mean, like, we're talking about violent crime, and I suppose that certainly the ghetto is more violent than it used to be, and it's more violent than probably where most people in here live. Though those statistics seem to affect people in here. Like, I live in the West Village. The West Village had 1 murder last year. 1 out of those 2,200. So it's a pretty safe place. Safer than most small towns, actually. So it's an interesting thing. I don't know what to say, because, you know, so many of the crimes in America are social crimes. So much of the crime against people is the crime that you can't walk into this store, or you can't have this job, or you can't do this thing. Women are, a lot of crime is, you know, like, affected on them, but it's not seen as crime. It's like that, you know, like when people are raped or abused. At one time that wasn't a crime, and now it is a crime. People not being able to get jobs, people not being able to get a fair education. You know, it's a funny thing to talk about crime. And so for me, you know, when I'm sitting here and people are telling me about, well, murderers are criminals, well, it's true. But the real issue for me is what's happening to the people, how people's lives are being disintegrated. I was raised in Watts, and Watts no longer like kind of exists. The stores that were there aren't there, the businesses that were there aren't there, the people are still there, and they have very few options. This, to me, is much more, what I'm concerned about is crime, and certainly in my books what I'm more concerned about, than, you know, who's getting killed where. So it's hard for me to answer the question.
Well, I think that people are being killed there and not here. I think the streets of New York and the more comfortable neighborhoods are safer than they were 10 years ago. It's anecdotal, but I haven't been stuck up on the street for 10 years. But I think what we've succeeded in doing is ghettoizing criminal violence. Yeah. I mean, I don't know how often you show a white person not from Long Island, Mike, on the 11 o'clock news who's a victim of a crime. Very, very seldom. The victims of crime in New York are, by and large, the black and the poor. We shelter for ourselves, and we don't do an awful lot about them, or care an awful lot about them, I'm afraid.
And they're the ones, the Hispanics, or Latinos, as we want to be called now, and the African Americans are those most clamoring, by my experience, for law and order.
Oh yeah, sure.
They should.
But not only from the police, you know, from the society in general.
Yeah. I think that's you and then you. I'm sorry.
I too am interested in the questions of guilt and innocence and the perception of guilt and innocence that writers affect. I agree with Judge Torres, they do affect them. I was thinking of 1970 and a trial, a famous trial that Murray Kempton wrote about. And in that trial, it was the prosecutor and the judicial that were found guilty. And most of the defendants in the Panther 21 went free.
So did the prosecutor and the judge.
Well, but the prosecutor didn't come back later and kill a lot of cops. So at the time, the trial was a cause célèbre, and there were cops inside on the stand, detectives testifying who had been undercover in various Black Panther organizations, and outside there were other undercovers protesting with the people, the populace, in their roles undercover. So a lot of things, a lot of perceptions change over time. And it's a question that interests me a lot, and I thought maybe Judge Torres or Mike Sheehan or you, Mr. Kempton, would...
I've talked too much already.
Okay.
I don't understand the question.
Well, I think the question goes to goes to how perceptions change
Of guilt and innocence.
of guilt and innocence. And that, let's say, I believe you spoke of the Panther 21 as having committed murders afterwards. It's only a coincidence, but I don't think any of them did. But your point would still be the same. And that is that an awful lot of times, I think you mean we let out violent people and have reason to be sorry for it afterwards. Is that the question?
Well,
I mean, we let out violent people because of failures of the evidence, and then we're sorry for it afterwards. It's only coincidence that those people didn't kill anybody.
I think maybe,
I'm glad to say they didn't, though, for their sakes.
well, I'm sorry, the names fail me, but the Panthers became
Yeah, but the thing is that
the Black Liberation Army.
I'm going to buy your question and buy your version. I didn't mean to contradict you. I'm going to buy your version, and if it's all right with you, convert your question into the whole problem of people who beat one case because the evidence is not strong enough, and then turn out to be criminals. And I don't know what you can do about, I mean, turn out to be violent criminals after all. I don't know what you can do about that, but I think somebody might want to comment on it.
But the question is about perception. I mean, your question is about perception. It's not about,
in part,
about evidence, which I think is very interesting. And I'll just turn it around.
Oh,
like,
good.
so,
I like to see what you do.
So as not to keep it on that level, which I don't like it on that level. I mean, not that it's not true. Rodney King. If you're a black person in America and you see Rodney King getting beaten by those policemen, your idea is this: well, this is the first time that we've documented what everybody knows. We think, at least believe, that black people are beaten every day in every city by police as a method of controlling the community and people in the community. And if you're a white person looking at it, you say, this is awful, this is terrible. This black person is being beaten and it's bad, but it's not happening everywhere. And so when it's proven, for whatever reason, that Rodney King deserved this beating, or at least the people who beat him didn't deserve to be convicted of a crime, people get very confused about the reaction or the response in the black community, which is, they're never going to understand us. We have to do something. I mean, this is my take on it, and I don't think it's very far away from yours.
But Walter, some of us who saw Rodney King being beaten by the police didn't think, look at this black person being beaten. We just thought, look at this person being beaten.
But which is not a historical response to it. You see, what I think that in the black community, which is say, you know, whether you believe what I'm about to say is true, that this happens every day in every big city to at least one man, and it's been happening for 100 years. That's what a black person will see when seeing it. And somebody else, why would they see that? They don't think that. They say, well, this is a person. Yes, this is a person. It's not black. It's not, it's not white. It's just a person getting beaten. But the issue is the perception is different, completely different. I remember the day after, like, Rodney King just got beaten, and I saw it. And I saw a policeman walking with, he had his stick and he was like twirling around because he's having fun with his stick. I was scared. I really was. I went, God, that guy could beat me with that stick. That's really upsetting. It's funny, but I don't think that if you were white you would think that. You say, well, I mean, it doesn't have anything to do with anything. It's a matter of perception. I'm talking about in the media instead of in writing.
No, I think white people are afraid of cops too.
Oh, yeah.
Well,
I think white people. I think all people do not like cops for the most part.
And you think it's the same.
We have a fear in us that a fear in any democracy is that it can turn into a police state at any moment. And I think we all have an inherent fear of cops, white, black, anybody.
I don't think so either.
Well, this is a guy who can kill you, which puts him in a very difficult position morally, God knows, poor help him. But the thing is that I think that it is true that I have never talked to anybody who grew up as a kid and was a kid of color in New York who does not remember an extremely unpleasant experience with policemen. I mean, I think that's a given, and I think it is just as bad as it ever was. But the other trouble is, and I think we ought to think about that, if you look at violent criminal assault and the penalties for violent criminal assault in New York City, you will find that the people who beat up Denny, the Denny guy on the truck, and that everybody, all of us, screamed about the lightness of that sentence, they got heavier sentences than prevail in New York City, in most cases, for assault with intent to kill. Where sometimes people get probation for this. And you get 1 to 2 or 3 to 4. These guys are going to serve more time than the overwhelming average of people who engage. And if we can't establish a law enforcement system where that kind of violence isn't dealt with, then I don't know what we're going to do. And usually, as you said earlier, it's guys, okay, beating on guys. But
yeah, it's true.
And the shortage of guys would not depress me, but at the same time, it is true that we are indifferent to this kind of criminal violence because it is done to the subclasses mostly. And anyway, I'm sorry, you had a question.
I think you were this side.
Oh, I'm sorry, ma'am. I apologize.
Hello. I have to make a statement, and then you'd understand where my question is coming from. I grew up, I was born, raised, and educated in East Harlem. I would say that crime reporting or crime journalist, what I see in the paper today is not always what was really happening. Quote, the highlights, what sells papers. That's what I find, since I did grow up in that atmosphere. Number two, I'm very familiar with McBain, Hunter, Marston, Cannon's work, and so Walter Mosley. I deal with that type of material. What I want to ask in that question is, why is it very difficult for crime writers or fiction crime writers today to write a good crime novel?
Are we still beating our wives? What kind of a question is that?
Well, when I say a good
I write
one,
damn good ones.
I didn't say you, I didn't say Mosley, but I'm saying on the whole, 400 books come out a year, and the crime novel is very bland. It is expanded from what should have been 198 pages to 300 pages, etc. I'll leave it at that. And if anybody can answer.
I really have to defend the crime writers of America. I really think that the crime novel today is much, much better than it was 20 or 30 years ago when it was populated with cardboard characters with nothing more on their minds than solving the puzzle. I think the crime novel today has found room in it for social comment, and I feel many, many crime writers are making social comment and are interested in characters and in the world we live in. So I really can't agree with you that the crime novel has gone downhill. I can't.
Okay, I just want to say that was the question presented to me weekly.
By whom? Do you run a bookshop? Yes.
They've read too many by now, that's all.
No.
I will agree with you on books where cats are the hero.
Here you are. Thank you, Judge.
It occurred to me as I was sitting here that literally even as we speak tonight, the Fox network, Mr. Sheehan's employer, this is not a judgment on Mr. Sheehan, but they are broadcasting a TV movie about the Menendez brothers case. And I'm just wondering, I think this raises both a legal law enforcement question, a justice question, and a literary question, if you will. What anyone thinks about, number one, does anyone think that this case represents some new plateau that we've reached in terms of the way we look at guilt or innocence, the whole matter of victimizing, making the victim somehow guilty? I'm thinking particularly of Mrs. Menendez, who no one, not even the defense, said was guilty of anything worse than possibly being a bad mother and had her head shot off, and yet has been demonized to the point where her sons were at least, that some of the jurors in the trial at least found they were not sure that they were guilty of this. and also from a literary point of view or a media point of view, the circus atmosphere that I really can't recall, to the extent that it's taken place. I mean, a crime, the combination of a crime of this seriousness getting this kind of treatment. I think we've had circus trials about less gruesome crimes maybe, but it just seems to have reached a new, as I say, a new plateau with this. So I was wondering if anyone had any thoughts about that.
Well, I don't think it's a new plateau. It's just a more exposed one. I get a steady diet of this sort of thing, and I'm constantly astonished at what jurors are capable of. Okay, the flights of logic, okay, and reason that I see on a daily basis with so-called sophisticated Manhattanite jurors, it just beggars credulity. I mean, like they say, you can literally sell 10 pounds of excrement in a 2-pound bag to any juror, okay? And it's just, I don't ascribe it to collective stupidity. What I suspect, let me give you the psychology, because I literally live with thousands of jurors yearly, okay? First of all, even your right of center, law and order type, when he gets in the jury box, he undergoes some kind of metamorphosis. And he tilts to the left instantly, okay? The fear of making a mistake, okay? And then I often find, because I had an acquittal just 2 weeks ago that I was going to pull my hair out, okay? Wherein, if it's too pat, if all the blocks, all the ducks are lined up in too orderly a fashion, then they get suspicious. And then, no, there must be something awry or askew here. I mean, even they have a confession, they have a newsreel of the thing. There's something wrong here, okay? I am astonished. And then the defense counsel will wax long and loud for 3 weeks on one issue. Call it turnips, okay? The defense bar will only zero in on bananas. Okay, and then the jury comes out with pineapples. You see, you cannot, and then I also think, by and large, certainly it is a New York County phenomena, it's as if there is a sense of transience in the mentality of, a guy could be a floor walker in Macy's for 30 years, but he doesn't serve a New Yorker, because he came from Keokuk or somewhere 90 years ago. So they don't have that sense of outrage about what's happening in their very community that you might find in some other counties or communities that I think that's another factor. And then the awesomeness of the responsibility, the fear of making a mistake, okay? And they will look for any excuse in many cases I've had to acquit. And the proof of it is when a juror, like for instance, two cases I've had just recently, 2 acquittals in a row. When they are going to acquit, there's a lightness in their step. You know beforehand they're going to acquit. They march out and they're smiling and they're jovial. They're gonna walk this guy. But if they're going to convict, it's like the March Slav. You know, they're ponderous. It's this sort of thing. It's something that we have to deal with. I myself, as a defense attorney, you know, pulled a few rabbits out, and I would even wonder, how did I ever sell this cockamamie nonsense here? Somebody bought it. Well, that's something, but that's our jury system. You have to live with it. You have to live with it.
Well, a lot of times prosecutors are pretty lame, Judge. No offense meant to them. I mean, you know, I'm perfectly ready to agree that if you put 12 people together on the island of Manhattan, you're going to catch 4 who believe anything. But I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that people prefer. I mean, Dick Revere wrote years ago about his case. It's no use writing a book, not a particular famous case, about writing a book in which you say the man is guilty, because people would rather read books where the guy is innocent. And the jurors have this, and I rather like that side of them, although it does sometimes stagger my imagination. These two. Bob, could you come up, because I think you're the one who will probably have to close the proceedings. Yeah. Oh, yes, we'll take 2 questions, but Bob can take them.
I think he wants to take our picture again, that's what he...
Oh, no.
I have a question.
Yes.
In the current hysteria about crime, all the politicians, whether they're liberal or conservative, are trying to outdo each other on how tough they are on criminals. I'd like to ask the three panel members on this side what their evaluation is of all these new proposals of passing more laws instead of a strict enforcement of the laws that are on the books now.
You mean the 67 death penalties?
There are 3 strikes and you're out, and there's all 50 different
Judge, I know
penalties.
but go ahead.
The interesting thing about three strikes you're out, I think, is as someone put it, if that third violent felony is going to automatically result in life in prison without parole, then there may be on the part of the criminal the idea that he should kill the victim because he doesn't incur a stronger penalty if the victim dies, because we don't have a death penalty, so you have life if the victim dies, and you have life if the victim lives. So someone has at least posited the idea that there might be on the part of the criminal a stronger rationalization of killing the victim. That's my comment on it.
I think that's very true. But you know, the awful thing is that a cab driver told me that when you're robbed in a cab, you should keep your head down like that. Because if the perp, as they call them already, like cops do, if the perp thinks you can identify him, there's a chance you can identify him, he'll shoot you.
He'll blow your head off.
So the fear of killing seems to be diminishing in that case.
I can allay your fears, sir. I detect you're of the proper liberal bent, etc. And I agree with you 100% on that. But fear not. Irrespective of what draconian laws are passed, and I say this from 36 years in the criminal justice system, okay? Irrespective of what laws are passed, three strikes you're out, whatever you want to call it, on the decisional or appellate level, the convolutions in which our system is now immersed will neutralize it to your satisfaction or better. So fear not.
And
we're not going anywhere.
And the juries won't convict.
Exactly, but we're not going anywhere.
Just my comment is that it makes for great lead stories for the 10 o'clock news.
You try to get a
crime
conviction.
program, you know.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, we could go on and into the night, and I myself would be very drawn to it, but there has to come an end to all good things. So I'm afraid we'll have to say that Judge Kempton's court is adjourned. Thank you very much.
I'm very embarrassed. Thank you very much. Actually, anyway, thank you.